I made a video recently talking about how stealth as a genre has somewhat fallen out of grace in the gaming industry. Companies are willing to include stealth as a mechanic in seemingly every title that comes out, but rare is the AAA game actually built around it. Now, on the surface, The Last of Us 2 fits that mold perfectly. I've seen no real consensus as to what genre it even belongs to, and Wikipedia labels it as an action-adventure game, putting it in the same category as Uncharted, which seems off. Personally, I would argue it shares the most roots with the survival horror lineage of RE4, although it can be played as a straight third-person cover shooter, and if I'm being honest, it probably just fits best into the vague category of narratively driven Sony game with unlimited budget, given that trying to strictly categorize these things has historically proven to be an exercise in futility. Most people associate The Last of Us and its sequel with the story, and as understandable as that is, it does somewhat drown out discussions on the actual game. The Last of Us 2 especially is very mechanically interesting, with a high skill ceiling and intricately designed encounters. But I want to narrow it down even further. I don't just think The Last of Us 2 has really cool gameplay in general. I think it has some of the most sound stealth mechanics of any recent AAA game. Despite the fact that it isn't commonly discussed in the same breath as Splinter Cell or Dishonored, when you look at the quality of the AI, the level design, and the player control, a lot of it doesn't just meet expectations within the genre, but actively raises the bar. It may not be the purest or most innovative stealth game out there, but in an era where the genre's most iconic franchises still lie dormant, The Last of Us 2's mechanics put many of the quote-unquote more pure stealth games of the 2020s to shame. Stealth is hit or miss when it's shoved into other genres, often acting as an optional mechanic that is dissonant from other, more fleshed out ideas. Part of what makes the gameplay of The Last of Us so seamless is that all of its chosen genre influences mesh together perfectly. It takes a lot of cues from survival horror, which lends itself wonderfully to stealth. Some of the best horror games, like Outlast and Alien Isolation, center around avoiding your enemies instead of tackling them head-on. On the more empowered side of the spectrum, you have games like RE4, where you are incentivized to conserve ammo and make every shot count. Finding yourself in a position where you have fewer bullets than you have opponents is a great way to push the player toward considering the sneaky approach. That feeling of frantically rummaging through drawers while a clicker is patrolling meters away is a tension I haven't fully felt since I was dodging hunters in the Spencer Mansion, looking for shotgun shells. In an open-world game like Ghost of Tsushima, combat and stealth are two totally different mechanics that rarely interact with each other. That's not a dig on that game, but in The Last of Us, horror, combat, and stealth synergize well together. The game is built around adaptability, with the player being expected to sneak around, get caught, deal with immediate threats, and find a way back into stealth, and repeat. Ellie and Abby are slow, clunky characters, with their animations taking time to blend into one another as they clamber up ledges and skulk along the ground. In stark contrast to the hero dives of Venom Snake, when Ellie hits the deck, she almost looks like she is tripping and falling. She's meant to be controlled methodically and intentionally. There has been a push in recent stealth games to let players be fast and fluid so that YouTubers can race to see who can put out the first "What 1,000 hours in blank game looks like" video. The Last of Us has the confidence to be slow. You have to slow down to a crawl to stay quiet, aiming is almost as hard as it was in the original Splinter Cell, and the camera is tight and claustrophobic to make it so that the player can easily get jumped from behind. And yet at the same time, a quick trip to the YouTube search bar will show that experienced players can extract frenetic, even John Wick-esque gameplay chains from the abilities the game gives you. You do see those 1,000 hours of Last of Us videos, because while the system is slow and deliberate, there is a ton of depth for players to explore under the surface. And even putting mechanics aside, horror is a great genre for incentivizing sneakiness. What better way to make the player want to be quiet than to fill your world with blind but terrifying monsters? I have played both these games so many times, but I still feel that tension that comes from slowly inching your way toward an exit right in front of a sleeping clicker. As Sam Fisher or Solid Snake or even Garrett, I always feel like I'm in control. But as Ellie, no matter how good at the game I get, the horror atmosphere of each encounter makes me feel like I am fighting to survive and escape. Horror is by no means necessary to make a great stealth game, but it goes a long way toward enhancing the experience both tonally and mechanically here. Enemy AI can make or break a stealth game, and The Last of Us 2 has some of the best AI I have ever faced. There is a lot of complexity involved in building enemies that don't just have an aggro on or off range, but have multiple detection states and tactical capabilities. Personally, I think innovative stealth AI is something of a lost art. I remember being blown away with every new Metal Gear game, as enemies gained more and more techniques for working together, calling for help, patrolling wider routes, and coordinating their attacks. That's not to say there's no innovation out there. The social stealth mechanics of the recent Hitman trilogy are fantastic, but they are an exception to the modern rule. In general, that's another flaw of the formula of sticking stealth haphazardly into other genres, especially open-world games. You take Horizon, Far Cry, Ghost of Tsushima, Assassin's Creed, or even Hogwarts Legacy, and all of them have the same simple camps with non-observant enemies waiting on their own to be slaughtered one by one. The Last of Us feels different. Even without getting into the weeds of its systems, the enemies feel so real, especially in the second game. Your opponents flank you in combat, they talk to each other, they patrol in realistic and difficult patterns. Killing a guard in AC Mirage has no consequences as long as I hide the body. In The Last of Us 2, enemies notice when a friend is missing and will become suspicious even if you do everything quietly. Be anything other than a perfect ghost, and these enemies are smart enough to take notice. A common problem stealth games run into is they struggle to keep the experience novel over a long period of time. The Last of Us 2 does a great job of forcing the player to adapt to a pretty wide variety of different obstacles. WLF crews have plenty of firepower, scars are a problem up close, clickers and shamblers are brutal but blind, stalkers will hide in the shadows to get the drop on you, dogs can track you if you become idle, and all of these require different approaches from the player. You even have multiple segments where factions are pitted against each other dynamically in real time. If you ever have the time, just sit and watch as a team of humans tries to work together to take out a group of infected, and you will see just how impressive this AI is. It's hard to find anything else like that, even in the best of stealth games. This sequel added so much to the systems found in the original game, which were already really good. Instead of digging deep into how these mechanics were built, I will refer you to this video series by AI in Games. These videos are a deep dive into how these games utilize the technique of finite state machines to craft believable enemy and ally behaviors that keep you immersed in the experience. I recommend all 3 of the videos on the 2 Last of Us games, as well as the channel in general, for learning more about video game AI. But you don't even need to know all of that to feel how different The Last of Us 2 is from the norm. Graphics are always getting better over the years, but AI seems to have stagnated a bit. A sentiment I have heard from others that I agree with is that this is one of the only games I've ever played where the AI doesn't feel like AI at all. The enemies act so intelligently that I find myself struggling to find other modern stealth games that are even worthy of comparison. It's a common cliche to compare stealth games to puzzle games, but the comparisons do ring true here. Games like Hitman would be nothing without the unique sandboxes each target is found in. Likewise, Splinter Cell's lighting and sound mechanics would be kind of worthless without memorable missions like the bank heist and the CIA headquarters to actually show them off. We can see how Naughty Dog's approach to 3D level design has evolved by looking at the influence of the Uncharted series. Drake's Fortune did a great job of setting that franchise up for success, but it was a much more linear game than what would come later. In Uncharted 2 Among Thieves, we started seeing verticality play a bigger role, and the improved enemy AI saw Drake traversing from building to building to avoid being flanked, making use of the whole area. Uncharted 4 took this a step further, experimenting with open-world environments that the player could explore at their leisure. All of this feeds into the types of maps we get to see in The Last of Us Part 2. Where lesser stealth games only offer one viable path through a given area, despite being linear, a second playthrough of this game can see you traversing areas you didn't even know existed to evade your enemies. On top of that, the toolset you get in the game is much more fleshed out than I think it gets credit for. This game would have been more than enough fun for me if all I had was my trusty brick or bottle, so being able to craft Molotovs, trap mines, smoke bombs, silencers, pipe bombs, and more offers up a lot of possibilities, more than even some more traditional stealth games. Improvements to mobility also change how the world is traversed compared to the last game. Some people clown Naughty Dog for advertising the ability to go prone and the jump button as big changes, but in all fairness, they do have a huge impact on the flow of stealth and combat. Ellie has so many more ways to hide than Joel due to her ability to lie down in the grass and hide under cars, while Joel could only crouch down or stand up. In addition to that, the ability to jump adds a whole new dimension to the way the zones of the second game can be laid out compared to the first. Being able to cross gaps with ease and get the drop on enemies from above gives Ellie and Abby a lot more room to use the environment to their advantage than Joel had. It isn't even a good jump button. It only really works if you're near a ledge and you just do this little pathetic hop otherwise, but as a contextual action, it does make a huge difference. I want to emphasize just how much the brilliance of all this shines in the game's hardest difficulty, Grounded mode. I am no difficulty purist, and you should play however is fun for you, but The Last of Us is one of those games where the harder difficulties really feel like the definitive way to play. The way the enemy perception and AI ramp up, the way your resources become so precious, the way a single hit can set you back so far. On normal, you can get away with some back and forth gunfights, but on Grounded, your stealth game needs to be perfect, and the tools you might ignore on easier difficulties become game changers. If you really want to experience The Last of Us 2 as a series of challenging puzzles to be solved using your own ingenuity and quick thinking, I recommend trying Grounded out. Again, all of this is much more complex than the flat camps we've been getting with stealth lately. Complex, challenging level design has always been a key aspect of stealth, and The Last of Us 2 is one of the few games of the decade keeping that alive. I don't mean to come off like I'm saying there have been no good stealth games this decade. Hitman 3 and Sniper Elite 5 have both helped keep AAA stealth alive, while the indie stealth scene has always had plenty of great titles. But when it comes to traditional crouch and cover stealth, so many modern games are content to rehash the same dumb AI and dull level design, and The Last of Us 2 is one of the few games that actually wants to push the genre's boundaries. That isn't to say the stealth is perfect. The stealth mechanics are very simple at the end of the day, and despite the complexity of the AI and level design, it can certainly get repetitive, especially on easier difficulties. In addition to that, the game is really long. While it does a great job of varying the encounter design, clocking in at 20 to 25 hours for a linear single-player game puts a lot of strain on what is, when all is said and done, a pretty limited set of mechanics. And while I really don't want to talk about things other than stealth in this video because conversations on this game can get ugly pretty quickly, I do want to acknowledge the fact that a lot of this game's incredible polish came at the cost of developer crunch and poor management, as per Jason Schreier's 2020 Kotaku article on the subject. This trend of making unimaginably expensive games that take so long to make and barely break even is not sustainable, and the impact on devs isn't worth things like random NPCs getting names. Now, looking at mechanics alone, The Last of Us 2 lacks the airtight stealth of a game like MGS5, and it doesn't have the creativity of Hitman. At the same time, though, Metal Gear, Splinter Cell, Dishonored, Tenchu, Thief, all of them have been dead for a long time. The industry, for whatever reason, isn't pushing them. In their place is this cavalcade of practically identical stealth experiences that see the sneaky option relegated to the background, while other mechanics get the actual attention. Stealth may not be the first thing that comes to mind when you think of The Last of Us 2, but personally, I think it's one of the few titles of the generation keeping the genre afloat. It has some of the best stealth AI ever, it meshes survival horror and pure stealth better than any game I have ever played, and the level and encounter designs keep the experience varied in ways that even the best stealth games out there have struggled with. The Last of Us 2 stands out as a game that respects the genre and actively makes it better, in an era where most companies seem content to let it fade to the background. That is all I have for today. The original Last of Us is one of my favorite games of all time, and while my feelings on the sequel are more complex, I feel like it deserves a bigger place in modern discussions about the stealth genre. I know that talking about this game at all invites discussions on the more controversial aspects of its plot, and that is of course your right to discuss that, but I will let you know that I'm not particularly interested in engaging with that in the comments myself. Those discussions have been done to death, and they're really not the point of this video, but in any case, I am curious as to how you feel about the gameplay of The Last of Us 2, and I would be more than happy to discuss that below. Otherwise, have a great day, and do take care of yourself.